Hannes, welcome. Thank you very much for agreeing to the interview with me. So Hannes Koekemoer, who is a criminologist for all our viewers out there. Tell me a little bit more about the role of a criminologist exactly. What is a criminologist?
So a criminologist, broadly defined, would be anyone that has specialized in dealing with crime or crime prevention or victims. So it's anyone that has basically done the studies or the work to kind of engage with the crime field. Okay. The definition in South Africa is currently quite broad, but there is some basic requirements for you to be called a qualified criminologist.
And police officers aren't criminologists, are they?
No, they're not.
Okay. What's the difference?
So police officers are trained for crime prevention specifics, but they're the foot soldiers. So they're the implementers of the theories that we come up with.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So in South Africa, if you need to have a master's degree in criminology, or if you've had like a sociology degree, but you've worked in crime prevention or policing, then you can have the title. But one of the main requirements is a master's degree and an active participation in the field.
Okay. And what got you into criminology? What sparked the interest?
So I was raised in a police household. So my dad was a cop for many, many years. And we were raised with this very strict ideology of what justice is. And I've always joked that I wanted to be within like a forensic psych type of environment. And then I discovered criminology and I was like, well, this is more my sense. But I feel that it gives me the space to actually give justice or to be part of a justice system that works.
Okay, but you're working at a specific prison in the Western Cape at the moment. Where are you working?
So I'm currently working from Goodwood Correctional Centre, but due to the limit amount of criminologists in the country, I service the entire Western Cape.
Ah, okay.
So I would assess any offender within the Western Cape region or any within that jurisdiction and wider if needed.
So you work for the Department of Correctional Services, mainly in Goodwood, but you extend your services across the province where needed. Okay.
Yes. So technically there's no formalized positions for criminologists in South Africa. So if you'd go to my payslip or to my appointment, it would still say correctional officer. But because I've done the studies, I've done the kind of the hours and the grunt work, I am being utilized for that service because they know it is rare. They know it is a scarce skill, although this post-establishment is a technical issue.
So what is the department looking from a criminologist? What's sort of the mission statements of a criminologist? What are you achieving on a day-to-day basis? What's the mission?
So the mission is so we do risk assessments. So we take an offender, we have a very long interview, and we check what is his propensity or the probability of him committing crime again.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, so if most of the reports that I write are pre-parole, so if someone qualifies or is in the parole process, I get called in to, if there's anything from denial to still violent behavior, anything that's a bit odd that the parole board wants to kind of figure out or explore, the offender gets then referred to me for risk assessment, and then I check and grill and dig to find out, is this person suitable?
So almost a criminal mind reader of sorts, eh?
Well, despite what my clients would think, I do not read minds.
Okay, fair enough. And tell us a little bit more about the methodology of assessments. How do you go about probing, asking questions? What's sort of your standard practice?
Luckily for us, the standard, Professor Hesselink from UNISA standardized an American way or the global way of doing assessments for South African audience, so to speak. And it has to do with, we do an in-depth interview. So I do an interview from childhood all the way up to the crime, and then I check for known risk factors that are specific to South Africa and to crime in South Africa, and also specific to offenders or specific crime categories.
I see it. There's definitely an overlap with psychology and psychiatry in the work that you do, I'm assuming.
Yes. So one of the best, we are the neurologist to the neurosurgeon. We identify the problems, and then obviously that means I have to have some knowledge of psychology, some knowledge of psychiatry, but again, we only observe and comment.
I see.
So if I see this offender has a probable personality issue, or there's something that bugs me, I would refer them to psychiatry or to a clinical psychologist to give a proper in-depth assessment from their perspective.
All right. So you play the very important role of assessing prisoners or inmates to see whether or not they're going to be a continued risk to society, whether they have the ability to be rehabilitated, so to speak. Would that be an accurate summary?
Yeah. So the rehabilitation is a very intangible at this moment. So you're just checking what is the probability of, and does the risks outweigh the benefits or the protective factors, or does the protective factors outweigh the risks?
Is there a certain personality type that is more risky than others, that indicates that they're going to be a further risk to society, or any traits or common traits that you've identified?
So in general speaking, that antisocial behavior is always a risk. Because
and what is antisocial behavior? Exactly?
So antisocial behavior is a collective set of behaviors. It's not necessarily what we would define as just a psychopath or sociopath. It is any behavior that someone lacks the ability to have insight to harm. Obviously, the psychological definition is a bit longer. I think to be classified as a psychopath, there's like a 40-point scale or 40-point indicator.
But generally a lack of empathy.
General lack of empathy and not caring about humanity.
Unfortunately, yeah. Unfortunately. Okay. What's interesting to me as a criminal attorney is the ability to potentially rehabilitate an individual that's committed a crime. In my practice of criminal defense law, I do assist an accused or arrestees sometimes with alternative disputes resolution avenues in the context of criminal defense. And one of the hot topics I'd like to discuss with you is the concept of diversion. Now, just very briefly for our viewers, now diversion was a system designed for youth offenders to divert them away from the criminal process, but into sort of a rehabilitative or rehabilitation type of program where they almost give back to society in alternative ways as opposed to serve a prison time and be punished in that way. I think the theory was that sending youngsters to prison ended up grooming them into greater criminals in the end because of the bad influences and the environments, the negative environments in which they had to serve their time, and that actually being counterproductive when it comes to rehabilitating them and reintegrating them into society as ones that don't commit crimes and act morally, so to speak. And it seems like diversion's been extended from youth offenders to adult offenders because that's exactly the type of service that the firm offers. In that even if you're 45 years old and you're a first offender, you may be eligible for diversion. What is diversion in your professional opinion as a criminologist, and does it work? Should it be extended to adults?
So it's one of those yes and no answers. So it was implemented under youth because if a 14-year-old goes to prison, his socialization turns to become more criminally inclined, becomes more antisocial because of the environment that prison is inherently. Whereas if we would then look at the risk factors, why did he commit crime? And then we say, oh, he didn't attend school, or he couldn't attend school. And by diverting him away from a large institution to a educational program or career program, we prevent the risk factors. Now, risk factors exist both youth and adults. So if we find out that an adult committed a crime, will punishment need to fit crime? So sending someone to prison that at the end of the day it would be more detrimental to society because you will create a new criminal, that is where diversion should be implemented. Not everybody would qualify, not everybody, it won't work for everyone.
What do you think is the bottom line in terms of qualifying for diversion as an accused person or an arrestee, let's say first offender? I would think genuine remorse?
Yes.
Taking of responsibility?
Taking responsibility, having remorse, having insight into what you have done. and seeing the harm, because you won't change behavior if you don't know the consequences.
Okay, not being in denial about what you've done, taking
Yeah.
responsibility, not blaming others, sort of the emotional intelligence required there.
Yes.
Exactly.
And not neutralizing your behavior.
What do you mean by neutralizing?
So most criminally inclined individuals or people that have done something wrong would use these methods of making the emotional baggage of committing something negative lessen by saying, well, I didn't do anything, I just did tax fraud. It didn't hurt anyone.
Undermining the seriousness of
Yes,
the offense.
they deny the victim or deny the injury of the crime, or they condemn the condemners is usually something very often used in South Africa. I'm not guilty, the judge said I'm guilty, or the law says I'm guilty. It's not their actions, it is someone else or someone bigger.
So they don't own it themselves.
Yes.
They don't take personal responsibility, and they don't recognize and respect the effects of their actions on others in the community.
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct, yeah.
All right. So that type of person would be disqualified from diversion,
Yeah.
I would say, categorically.
Yeah.
So I like the concept of diversion in my practice as a criminal lawyer because I feel like it provides a very practical and appropriate resolution for those who may be deserving of it. I like the concept of restorative justice built beneath it, where it says, okay, someone's done something wrong, but if they're genuinely remorseful and they acknowledge that they've made a mistake, they'd like to give back to society, compensate society for their wrongdoings, they can do so in a way in which allows them to avoid going to prison, spending time with other inmates, and actually rather do some community service. Now, how do we tell what's appropriate under the circumstances?
There was a landmark case in the Western Cape, the Pleitjies case, where the judge implemented a form of diversion, where the judge realized the crime itself is punishment to the mother, and the best or appropriate response would not sending a mother to prison, because it would do more harm than good. But instead decided that the plaintiff, or the accused, should go to, I think it was like 4 years or 5 years worth of community service.
Wow, that's a long time. So there's different levels of diversion,
yes,
right?
there's different levels, yeah. So but I think it was the amount of hours accumulated to quite an extended period of doing community service at a rehab facility.
Sure. Wow.
That's
going to instill some interesting new habits for an individual, huh?
Yes, but it also...
That's the point, right?
That's the point. But it's also the cornerstone of restorative justice is giving back to a community that you've taken from. Because with everything taken, there are both direct and indirect consequences. For someone going to work at a rehab facility that's an addict, or someone that will not always be appropriate, but let's say they're forced to work in a farming community, or they have to do a agricultural project, that gives back to a community that they've stolen from. So in that process, they learn that I am not alone, that I am a greater community, I am part of a greater society, and that my actions, both good and bad, have direct influences on the environment around me and the community around me.
Wow, that's interesting. So it needs to be an appropriate form of community service that's going to elicit that type of acknowledgement and that type of behavior change. So it's not about just going to Bloberg and washing penguins in Sandcob or something like that, or joining Rotary or Lions International. You need to do something more community specific, not to undermine the value of those other organizations, but in the context of diversion, looking for behavior change, it's interesting to see what options are available that may be appropriate and achieve those ends.
Yes, and also it needs to be functional. If someone committed a crime that's against animal cruelty, for them to go to clean up the penguins or to work at a zoo will inherently instill a greater, if not love for animals, then at least appreciation for animals. And if someone can appreciate what, let's say, the wrongdoing of hurting an animal, their behavior will change.
Let's hope, as long as
But
they are.
we hope.
Yeah, as long as they're not completely psychopathic. I mean, it's hard to judge these things. So,
Yeah.
I mean, would you work in consultation with psychologists and psychiatrists in the work that you do?
It's one of the things that I prefer.
Okay.
Because it's in a multidisciplinary team, you are not just relying on your own knowledge and your own experience. You also have the active voices of your colleagues. So if you are assessing a individual, you're building a greater view of who that person is. And people can have different rapport or different presentations. Let's say I'm a white male, a African offender or a white offender will have different views or different language that they use towards me. And that has an influence about how I view them. And that's why it's always, I cannot stress the importance of a multidisciplinary, multilingual, multicultural view.
Especially in a country as diverse as South Africa.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And I've had cases where the offender's presentation is different with me because I'm a male versus having an interview with a female psychologist.
So the different lenses from which you are seen, either from either side, can certainly affect and or create potential bias or prejudice that needs to be neutralized through a more holistic, more inclusive, and a more inclusive approach in terms of related professionals, I would say.
And at the end of the day, you're looking also for the kind of statistical validity or reliability. If 3 people from 3 different fields or 4 different fields view one risk and they see this is a risk, then it is definitely a risk. Whereas if you have one person looking at a cube, they will only see one side of it. And at the end of the day, you want to kind of color in the entire Rubik's Cube.
Absolutely. It's like the saying of 2 minds together creates a third mind.
Yes.
You know, it creates that alternative perspective and almost allows you to access a higher level of intelligence sometimes.
Well,
Quote me, don't quote me. That's what we hope anyway. Collective intelligence, I think, is the term there. With the work that you do, are there any particular life circumstances that suggest that someone may end up becoming a criminal one day, such as maybe childhood trauma or abuse while they were minors? Is there anything like that that you've encountered? Any predictors of criminal activity, in other words?
So, people always enter the nature versus nurture debate. And think it should be one or the other, whereas it's more a nature times nurture. So you do have personality traits or personality factors that can influence. Some personality disorders are more prone to criminal behavior or antisocial behavior, but also certain environments. If you take the Cape Flats, for instance, there was a wonderful lecturer at UCT who wrote about the first 1,000 days and the influence on epigenetics, and he had this discussion about children growing up in high violent areas not building empathy as a protective factor towards the environment.
Interesting.
So someone growing up in an impoverished area has limited access to pro-social means. So some people will be in an environment where they have the personality strength or the character strength to still develop and still become pro-social environments or become a doctor or lawyer, or they can rise above it. It's not unique. But if an environment's entire space is designed to funnel people to criminal activities, then the one not being a criminal is the odd one out.
Interesting. What do you think about the saying, the abused become the abusers?
I don't want to full-heartedly agree with it, but there are a lot of evidence regarding the cycle of violence.
Okay.
And the cycle of violence is something that I'm really passionate about, because we think that physical violence begets physical violence, but violence can be both physical, verbal, structural, systemic, and every person responds differently. If I grow up in a violent environment, let's say I was physically abused or I was assaulted, it's not to say that I will assault someone else, but I might be verbally aggressive. My defensive measures might be aggressive to anyone else. And so violence can shift. It can change from a physical form to a psychological form or to emotional form. But there's definitely a cycle of perpetuation that happens.
Absolutely. You know, in my practice of family law in conjunction or in parallel with criminal law, I do deal with a lot of high conflict personality type of divorces or high conflict divorces where you have certain personality disorders that cause problems in the family unit structure, such as narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, antisocial behavior,
Yes.
histrionic, and there are others. But those seem to be the top four that are documented in general difficult cases. Do you have any experience dealing with personality disorders in your work? You mentioned antisocial behavior. Anything
So
on the narcissistic side?
I've interviewed both the kind of the entire spectrum. So I have interviewed narcissists. I have interviewed people with borderline personality, and that alters at the end of the day how I question an individual.
Diagnosed? That you suspect or that
No,
have been diagnosed already? Oh, really?
Yeah. So
Okay.
we, as criminologists, are not allowed
We
to
can't make a diagnosis, nor
Yes.
can lawyers, of course.
Yeah, so we observe if someone has a diagnosis, that does affect the crime capacity or the criminal propensity. For instance, someone that is borderline has a high death drive or high self-destructive characteristic.
They can be prone to self-harm and suicide.
Self-harm, suicide, but also addictive behaviors or addiction, lying and things like that.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, that will then fit to, let's say, if someone is borderline and they use drugs, that might lead to theft, and it might lead to participating in criminal elements to fulfill the addiction, which fulfills the bipolar.
Oh, it's a vicious cycle.
It is a vicious cycle, and it's often very hard to break, especially in South Africa, where there's a stigma regarding mental illness and a discussion on mental illness.
Absolutely. I think the common denominator amongst those personality disorders are those individuals that just lack empathy, that they lie, they blame others, they never take personal responsibility for things, and they'll gaslight. But ultimately, it's centered around a lack of empathy for individuals. Is there a way to teach people empathy?
Well, yes. we always, empathy is biological. You have a part of your brain that can kind of mirror pain. So we all know the classical, if someone gets attacked or hit in certain areas, we all have a response.
Well, this is why violent movies, action movies are so popular, horror movies are so popular, because we have that response.
Yes, but it's also because we have inherently a crave for...
There is a slightly sadistic crave for it, isn't
Yes.
it? Not that many people would admit that.
But we can teach with obviously in-depth psychotherapy. We can teach people how to care, so that at least they have a cognitive empathy. So they although they can't feel the emotional component, intellectually they can realize, or they have the insight that I am hurting someone. Hurting someone is bad, or that my actions have a consequence, and that consequence creates harm. So that they have the intellectual capacity to do it. And I think sometimes we ask a lot in the sense about how empathy should look. We all think empathy should be the crying shoulder or the...
It can be different things for different people.
Different things for different people.
Okay.
And if I've interviewed a few very hardened criminals, now they've been in prison for years. Prison is not an environment for anything soft.
No, it's not. It's a sign of weakness, isn't it?
Yeah. So for him, just the verbal acknowledgement is a great development in him having cognitive empathy is a big step.
So it almost becomes a relative concept.
It does.
Depending on the context and the environment.
Yeah.
Prisons in South Africa, without placing you in a controversial professional position, there are some notorious prisons around the corner here in Cape Town. We're filming this in the CBD of Cape Town. We have the infamous or notorious Polesmoor prison that's down the road in Tokai. That's a maximum security prison, and it's been the feature of some prison documentaries, including Ross Kemp, maybe over a decade ago, who visited there, and others I think you'll find on Netflix. Is it as bad as they depict it in these documentaries, the conditions, the gangsterism, and the potential corruption? Because it looks like a nightmare when you look at that on television.
So just to kind of clarify so Polesmoor is not just one facility, it houses multiple. So the CMAX that there is, or the waiting trial prison, is known for many things. But it is, prisons by its design is containment. And that means a lot of things can happen.
Physical containment, it seems.
Yes, but a lot of things can happen where an official or warden does not have the space to control. We cannot, at the end of the day, control human behavior. And with that, if you take everybody that does not follow the rules and you put them in one space, you are bound to have some explosive reactions.
Or breeding ground for the counterintuitive.
Yes. But whether our prisons is the worst in the world is also very subjective. Because what a official will find the worst prison, and what Ross Kemp finds the worst prison, or what any other journalist would do, is again also what they've observed on that day. Like any institution, there are good days, there are bad days.
Just like lawyers, there are some good lawyers out there and there's some bad lawyers out there. It just boils down to ethics, values, and standards. I think I've reached the end of the interview, and I see the sun's now shining on your face here in Cape Town, so it's also distracting ever so slightly. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to make as a criminologist being interviewed by a lawyer to debunk any of the myths out there?
So, we are not criminal minds.
Okay.
There is a belief of this American popularized version about what a criminologist is. And it's not to say that in the broader spectrum of criminology that you don't have those people, but there is a difference between what I do, which is more soft evidence profiling, because I have an individual with me. I'm not working with blood and spatters. I'm not working with forensic reports, versus someone working in police as a crime analyst or as a profiler, where they do deal with the hard evidence to find the individual. So it's two sides of the same coin, and in an ideal world they are married and they work perfectly together. It's a fluid understanding of crime and criminality. Whereas I know people think that we can predict crime, that we are sitting somewhere with glass balls.
Criminal soothsayers, hey?
Yes.
Indeed. Okay.
But we are not that.
All right. Well, Hannes, you speak very passionately about your subject. I can see you really enjoy what you do, and I just wanted to thank you very much for your time today.
It's been a pleasure.